Before we start the program, I would like to share some housekeeping information. First, this is not a CLE accredited program. Second, you may submit questions at any time during the program using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Finally, this program is being recorded. Welcome to On the Front Lines, How Diversity Dictates Justice, sponsored by the American Bar Association Criminal Justice Section. And now we will hear from Ms. Alaby.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. On behalf of the American Bar Association Criminal Justice Section, we welcome you to On the Front Lines, How Diversity Dictates Justice webinar. I'm Andrea Alaby. I'm a Managing Assistant District Attorney from the Gwinnett Judicial Circuit here in Lawrenceville, Georgia. I also serve as Diversity and Inclusion Fellow for the American Bar Association Criminal Justice Section. We have all heard the calls for justice. Those calls were more amplified this year, so you're going to be hearing from the people who are on the front lines. They play a direct role in the cases that tug at our conscience and our hearts, and the cases that we never hear about. We hope that this presentation is thought-provoking, impactful, and arms you with the desire to create the necessary changes in your profession, in your office, and in your life. Special thank you to our esteemed panelists, Criminal Justice Section Chair April Frazier, for allowing me to create this safe space for this much-needed discussion, and to this evening's moderator and my dear friend, Samantha Ruth. Thank you.
Thank you. On mute, Samantha.
Good call. Thank you, Professor Bird. So once again, thank you so much for the introductions, Andrea. I am the moderator for tonight. I appreciate and look forward to this opportunity. I'm going to begin by introducing our esteemed panelists. We're going to begin with the Honorable Charles Brooks. After receiving his Bachelor of Arts in History from Alabama State University, Mr. Brooks returned to his alma mater, Forest Park High School, to serve as a mentor and teacher. His love for people and sense of goodwill eventually led him to Osaka, Japan, where he taught English to children and adults. While teaching in Japan, he studied, applied, and was accepted to the University of Georgia School of Law. There, he was acknowledged as an intelligent, competent, honest, and fair-minded individual. Mr. Brooks won many accolades while at Georgia Law for both his academic prowess and advocacy talents. He began his legal career in the Clayton County District Attorney's Office, prosecuting felonies before transitioning to the Clayton County Solicitor General's Office. While there, he rose through the ranks to the elected position of Solicitor General. His leadership in the office has been recognized in the community he serves, as he is also a graduate of the Clayton County Chamber of Commerce Leadership Clayton Program, as well as the Atlanta Regional Commission Regional Leadership Institute. Yet, if you ask Mr. Brooks what he wants to do, he will always simply state, "I just want to serve." Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Charles Brooks. Mr. Brooks, if you'll raise and wave at the audience, please. Next up, we have Mr. Myungjae Yi, who currently serves as the Section Chief of the Queens County District Attorney's Office of Immigrant Affairs. In that role, he prosecutes various crime schemes targeting immigrants, oversees his office's U visa and T visa certifications, conducts community outreach and fraud prevention seminars, and trains incoming prosecutors and NYPD officers in the intersection of criminal and immigration law. Prior to this, Mr. Yi served in the Organized Crime and Rackets Bureau, where he led long-term wiretap and undercover investigations to dismantle criminal enterprises, trafficking narcotics, stolen luxury automobiles, and firearms. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Yi, if you'll raise and wave at the audience, thank you. Next up, we have Ms. Stacy Levy, who is a 1993 graduate of Emory School of Law. She has practiced almost exclusively in the area of criminal defense her entire career. Upon graduation, she worked at the DeKalb County Public Defender's Office with amazingly talented and experienced colleagues. The majority of her time was spent in the courtroom, with her very first jury trial occurring 4 months after her graduation. Ms. Levy describes her tenure with the Public Defender's Office as invaluable. She has been in private practice since leaving the Public Defender's Office in 2000. She had hoped to be retired by now, living in Utah and taking care of rescue animals, but unfortunately, she has not won the lottery yet. Ms. Levy. We then have with us Professor Josh Bird, who is a former U.S. Marine Corps veteran with more than 20 years of experience as a criminal justice professional. In addition to his legal experience, which includes clerkships with the U.S. EPA in Boston, Massachusetts, and in Washington, D.C., he has served as a staff attorney for a multinational legal consulting organization. He also served as a deputy sheriff with the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office and trained law enforcement executives for a law enforcement leadership academy. Professor Bird currently serves as a program chair and professor for the School of Criminal Justice at American Intercontinental University. He also serves as vice president for Hawk Protection Group, which is a private security firm. He is also the founder of Teach Us Justice, an educational enterprise that endeavors to teach ethics and cultural history to urban stakeholders. He obtained his bachelor's degree from Georgia State University, his master's degree from the University of Cincinnati, and his Juris Doctorate degree from North Carolina Central University School of Law. He is currently pursuing a doctorate degree in computer science with a concentration in cybersecurity at Colorado Technical University. Professor Bird. There he is, waving at us. We then have with us Corporal Colin Flynn, who is a 14-year law enforcement veteran of the Gwinnett County Police Department out of Gwinnett County, Georgia. Corporal Flynn has worked in numerous positions within the police department to include the robbery unit and homicide unit. He has also worked as a full-time instructor at the county's police academy, where he has taught recruits, certified police officers, and continues to be an adjunct instructor. He has received several awards and commendations throughout his career and has been a guest instructor at the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association in St. Louis. He is currently the Public Information Officer for the Police Department, where he acts as a liaison for the police department to the Atlanta media. Corporal Flynn. There he is, waving at us. And then finally, to round out our esteemed panel, we have Lieutenant Michael Reddick, who is a 24-year veteran of the Gwinnett County Police Department. He hails from Detroit, Michigan, born and raised. He moved to Georgia to attend Morehouse College. Lieutenant Reddick comes from a family line of law enforcement officers who instilled in him the desire to serve his community. Lieutenant Reddick wanted to bridge the gap between law enforcement officers and the community at large, which is what eventually spurred him to his decision to join the police department. During his career, he has worked in CID, the Criminal Investigations Division, specifically investigating white-collar crimes. He has also served as a SWAT crisis negotiator for 19 years and is currently a lieutenant in the new Community Affairs Unit at the Gwinnett County Police Department. Lieutenant Reddick possesses a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice from Liberty University. Lieutenant Reddick. And there he is. Okay. So now that we have introduced our esteemed panel, we would like to go ahead and get started with the topics for tonight. As Andrea and Ms. Payne have introduced to you, we are talking about On the Front Lines, How Diversity Dictates Justice. We have a group of prosecutors, defense attorneys, professors, as well as law enforcement officers, so that we can give you a full range of perspectives tonight. I want to begin by speaking with Mr. Brooks, if you'll unmute yourself. There you are. And Mr. Brooks, specifically, you have the advantage of being and having not only felony experience, prosecutorial experience, but also misdemeanor prosecutorial experience. You've been in the game for a while. So if you don't mind, tell us how prosecution has changed. The prosecution pre-social unrest, what we're currently going through, the during social unrest, and where the future of prosecution is going.
Well, first, let me say thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be on this panel, and looking forward to a great dialogue with my colleagues and additional panelists. That's a great question. Prosecution of past was very reactive. And I think in the 80s, it was with 3 strikes and you're out. Life mandatory minimums, those types of things. I think in contemporary times, prosecution is a lot more proactive. You have a lot of offices that are starting community prosecution units. There's a huge investment in restorative justice, not just being punitive in the criminal justice system, but also restoring people to be productive citizens in their communities, as well as being proactive and getting more involved in youth affairs, to the extent that if you can divert kids from entering a life of criminality, then hopefully you'll be intervening in that school to prison pipeline. I think that's one of the biggest changes that you'll see in contemporary times as it relates to prosecution of old. It's a lot more proactive and less reactive. We're on the front side of it, trying to prevent it as opposed to react to it or respond to it.
And that I want to jump over to Ms. Levy. She has the perspective from being a defense attorney, so on the opposite side of Mr. Brooks. What changes have you seen in the criminal justice system that you feel has been a call from society?
The development of accountability courts. It started with drug court, and I think they saw a lot of success giving people an opportunity, not just for treatment, to get something that they maybe could not get at home or they couldn't afford. When you have an accountability court, you have a team of people who are really all rooting for you to be successful. There is a fee, but it's certainly not as much as it would be to go to a private facility. And I think the success of the drug court has now brought us veterans court, DUI court, mental health court, which now that they've gone on for quite a few years, I mean, I've personally witnessed some of my clients be the success stories, which is amazing. And not only successful in working out a drug addiction, a mental health issue, not becoming a convicted felon, which then leads them to the next step of, yes, they've handled a drug addiction, but now they're a convicted felon and they're having a hard time finding a job. So it's really twofold, not just the support, emotional, but allowing them to then be financially independent by actually getting a job when they've done all these great things to help better themselves. So that's been tremendous.
And how often have you found in your experience that defendants or people who take advantage of these particular programs have successfully completed them?
You know, once I resolve a case, I don't always follow up, or I'm not always given that information, but quite a few times I've gotten a letter, I've gotten a card from clients, and I've had clients that have finished these programs in other jurisdictions that have just told me that it's changed their life. They're working full time, they're on the proper medication. You know, I mean, these are lifelong problems that are helped through these 18 to 24-month programs.
And do you see that this is going to just be another avenue for people in the criminal justice system to take advantage of? Is this going to increase in the future, you think?
I hope so. I mean, again, we started with drug court, and then we ended up with mental health court, and now we have VA court, and there's DUI court. And there's also some pretrial diversion programs that I know Gwinnett has been implementing. So it's not just resolving the underlying issue, it's what's going to happen when you're done with that. Are you going to be a convicted felon and not be able to get a job? Or are you going to resolve an underlying issue and then be able to be a productive member of society, which being a convicted felon makes it difficult for a lot of people to do that. So it's an opportunity if you really want it. I think sometimes clients think it's a get out of jail free card, and I'm very clear that you could end up doing more time if you fail out of that than if you just take your probation. So and I also hate to see a spot taken up for somebody that really wants the help. So I think they're amazing. I really do. I've gone to a graduation. It's really heartwarming to see people who have worked really hard to overcome a substance abuse or a mental health issue, which, you know, it's amazing. And it's amazing the support that they get in these programs, which is invaluable. It's a team.
That's fantastic. And Mr. Brooks, if you don't mind, I have a question for you in relation to accountability courts. Is that a program that you're familiar with as Solicitor General?
Absolutely. Accountability courts, as Ms. Levy advised, have been around for years and increasing every day. Just to name a few, I know she mentioned mental health court. Some areas have domestic violence accountability courts. In addition to the different types of accountability courts, my office actually, we host a pretrial diversion program. In those diversion programs, essentially, it's a second chance program to keep first-time offenders from creating a criminal history. What you find in criminology is that once you start a history, it's hard, it grows, it snowballs. And so if you can stop it from the very beginning, then the goal is that that it doesn't continue. And so a lot of offices have pretrial diversion programs as a part of this whole restorative justice notion. Accountability courts, diversion programs, and community outreach. That's all within the umbrella of restorative justice.
And in your experience, have you seen from the prosecution standpoint that it's a general success?
Yes, yes. I would say probably in the 90 percentile range. About 10% of participants are unsuccessful, but in large, the large majority of participants that are serious about the program graduate from the program, because again, you have a whole team of people supporting you and rooting you on. And and with diversion programs as well as accountability course, they offer wraparound services. And so if the need is codependencies, where you have both a mental health issue as well as a drug issue, you're getting treatment in both areas. And so to the extent that you want to be successful, you absolutely can be successful. I will also add that within the restorative justice umbrella, we also have a number of prosecution offices are hosting record restriction fairs, what formerly was known as expungement. These record restriction fairs are an opportunity for a person who may have been a youthful offender, or somebody who may have gotten arrested, but the case was later dismissed or not prosecuted. They can expunge or restrict that off of their history to allow them the opportunity to get gainful employment or in a better living situation. And so under that, the umbrella of restorative justice also falls record restrictions.
And is it fair to say that the idea is to break, if you will, the cycle, to give people the opportunity to start over and to basically shift paths from either a criminal background or criminal path versus one that would take them out of that? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. And breaking the cycle and diverting onto being a productive citizen. The goal of the criminal justice system is twofold. It's punitive and restorative. And so in past, and going back to your first question, in the past, there was an emphasis on the punitive side. In present, there's more of an emphasis on the restorative side.
And how involved is the prosecutor in deciding that someone should or should not be able to take advantage of one of these programs?
In most cases, the prosecutor is the one that's making the referral. Because a lot of times the court only gets the case after the prosecution accuses or indicts. And so the first look at the case, the first assessment of criminal history comes from the prosecutor to make the referral.
And Ms. Levy, have you found that to be an accurate statement as well, that the prosecutors are actively involved in helping or deciding if someone should be applied to a certain program?
Well, I think at the end of the day, there's a panel that decides if someone's admitted to a program. But for me, depending on when I meet my client, if it's early in the process, I will reach out early in the process, especially if they're incarcerated, and suggest that we do an application. Certain crimes, although it's gotten less strict, certain crimes won't allow you to be in certain programs. I think if you have a sale of drugs or a possession with intent to distribute, you can't be in drug court. And they used to have some restrictions on violent crimes that couldn't be in mental health court. I think that's relaxed a bit, but I like to try and get in there early, depending on, when I meet the client, to see if that's a possibility, because that might help speed something along in the criminal justice system, especially if they're incarcerated.
Okay. And now I want to go over to Mr. Yee. I've had the pleasure of speaking with him previously, and I know, and as the audience heard, he is the section chief for the Office of Immigrant Affairs, which in Georgia, for me as a prosecutor, and I think that Mr. Brooks will agree, as well as Ms. Levy as a defense attorney, that's not something that we'd ever really heard of. So Mr. Yee, if you can explain to the audience what it is that particular office does, and why was it necessary for the Queens County District Attorney's Office to actually implement that type of a section?
Yes. Well, first, hello, everyone. I'm the one lone New Yorker and foreigner to you guys, and I'm the one with the accent today, from what I'm told.
Excuse me, Long Island, born and raised. Thank you. 30 years in Georgia will get you y'all, though. All right.
So listen, I did some Wikipedia quick search on the demographics between Fulton County and Queens County, where I am now currently in. From what I briefly read, Fulton County, which includes the famous city of Georgia, has roughly a little bit over 1 million people. And the demographics basically turns out to be about 45% African-American, another 40% white, and then the remaining percentage divided amongst Asians, Latino, and whatever else. In comparison, Queens County has about 2.3 million people, and our demographics are about 25% each of African-American, Latino, Asian, and I'm sorry, what am I missing?
White.
White, yes. So we're pretty evenly squared up. Now, amongst the 2.3 million people, literally half of them are immigrants. That's a big number. We're talking about over 1 million people in our county that are immigrants. And ballpark census estimates, about 600,000 people in New York City are undocumented immigrants. So that being said, you could imagine you've all seen the news recently. Even before the Trump administration, it was really rough and scary for undocumented immigrants to approach law enforcement for any kind of help. On the flip side, what if they're the witness to a burglary, a robbery, an assault, a shooting? Do you think they're going to raise their hand and call 911 and give their information to help solve this crime? It's not going to happen. So that being said, in a county like Queens, we have been encountering this unreporting plus the fear of witnesses cooperating because of their immigration status to be a really big problem for the entire society. So that being said, the Queens DA's office in January of 2015, so in about a month, our 60th year anniversary will come up. The Office of Immigrant Affairs was created to combat this problem. And a unit was created where we investigate and prosecute cases targeting immigrants. For example, the Immigration Assistance Services fraud, where you have fake notarios or people pretending to be lawyers, or even real lawyers who are really scamming immigrants out of their money when they're trying to get their green card status or just trying to get work authorization papers or whatnot, because they're such easy targets, including whole sorts of other schemes that come up. And we have people who are dedicated to prosecuting and becoming experts in that field. It only helps to combat these problems and develop a trust with the immigrant population. So it's been 6 years, and we also have a very dedicated portion to outreach, because again, we need that community partnership to combat the problems that I just talked about. We can't do it alone as police and prosecutors. We need the help of the eyes and ears, which are living out in the community-based organizations, the clergy, all the school teachers, all the whoever else, the YMCA, the local communities who are encountering the immigrant population on a daily basis, to let us know, not only to refer crimes and to connect us to victims and witnesses, but again, to ensure that we are there to help. And finally, I also want to point out that both New York City and New York State each have executive orders from the governor and the mayor saying that city agency workers, including law enforcement, are not to ask victims or witnesses about their immigration status. I'm not sure what the situation is in Georgia, but we have executive orders both on the city and state level to not ask that question, unless of course you're investigating as a law enforcement officer, somebody who's defrauding, their immigration status issues. But regardless, that's something, it's such an important message that we have to get out to the community, and the resources are necessary to do that. And not every office is dedicated, but I am happy to report that not only all 5 boroughs within New York City, which is Staten Island, Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, and Manhattan, are local jurisdictions, including Nassau County, Long Island, and we're working on Suffolk, by the way, Ms. Levy, also Rockland County, and a couple of other neighbors. We now have 9 total DA's offices who have dedicated resources to establishing an immigration fraud unit for the purpose that I just spoke about. So that's something that we're very excited about and has been very fruitful. And we hope that it could spread even to jurisdictions like Georgia as you guys diversify.
Absolutely. And tell the panelists as well as the audience a little bit about specific resources that you provide to the immigrant population in your jurisdiction.
Sure. So we have something called the advisory councils, and there are several. First, there's Latino advisory, African American, Asian American, and recently with our new DA, there's been expansion of it. Now there's an LGBTQ advisory committee. There is a Southeast Asian. And also recently formed was something called the labor unions, because a lot of workers are undocumented, for example, and there's a big wage theft problem. And that's something that I'm also now starting to learn about and work on. So that being said, we have a host of community leaders, clergy members from all walks of life and all sorts of communities who are now in these advisory committees, meet maybe quarterly, every couple of months, to advise the DA about what's going on in their communities and be eyes and ears. And also people like me, we give presentations to the resources available to their communities. So sometimes when they hear about what my office does, they say, hey, can you come speak at our church? Can you speak at our organization and do the fraud prevention seminars? What can my immigrant church member do when she's been defrauded all these things, but she's afraid to come to you guys, or she can't afford a lawyer? These are things that have been taking a lot of time to build trust and work in an efficient manner, but I could tell you that it's very worthwhile.
And do you find at the advisory committees, you had mentioned that when the community leaders come, they talk to you about what's going on currently in their community. Are they forthright about it?
Yes, and there is a large vetting process to become an advisory member. These are people who have a stake in the community, and that's something that could be verified. And they're not just anybody who applied and just comes in. So that being said, they're trusted members of the community. And secondly, they're going to have to commit to it too. It's not only their time and their resources, but you could imagine, for example, a very leader of a church with a congregation of 1,000 people, they have a lot at stake and a lot of people. So they're not going to come and not be forthright about certain things.
And Mr. Brooks, I want to ask you about this particular topic. Now that you have heard Mr. Yee discuss the Office of Immigrant Affairs and the advisory committees, how do you feel about it? Do you think that's something that your jurisdiction or that here in Georgia would be beneficial?
It's funny that you would ask that, because I was just thinking I'm going to take a trip to Queens County DA's office to explore their unit, actually, because in Clayton County, where I'm at, a number of our municipalities have large immigrant populations. The county, as a whole, is majority minority, but in pockets of the county, there are areas there that immigrant and immigrant population is majority. And so I would definitely like to explore that unit, particularly more in depth in Queens.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've just made a connection for the two of you. We look forward to seeing what kind of changes Mr. Brooks is going to bring to Clayton County, and eventually see if that can spread through the rest of Georgia. And now I do want to take a little bit of a shift. Briefly, I want to talk a little bit about law enforcement misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct. I want to talk initially, and in my experience as a prosecutor, it has become a little bit more common, I have found, for defense attorneys to file open records requests, if you will, on internal affair files of certain law enforcement officers. Ms. Levy, I would like your viewpoint on this particular topic. Is this something that you have found to be common among your colleagues? Do you think it's going to become more common? Is it beneficial, not beneficial?
I have done it a few times when I felt like it was warranted. It's not one of I'm filing a discovery motion and I'm filing an open records request. So to me, it's not that common practice. I know attorneys that do it on all their cases. And honestly, I don't know if anything has really been fruitful from that. Sometimes you could see if because what you're getting their training, and maybe they've been disciplined. And again, I've done it a few times, and there have been some situations where an officer's been disciplined for a particular reason, so it's been helpful to my case, but not so that I feel like I need to do it in every case.
Okay. And do you also weigh it against the type of charges that your client is facing?
Yes. Obviously, I'm hopeful that the police are conducting themselves appropriately in every encounter, whether or not it's serious or a traffic ticket. But now we have the benefit of body cam, so we can actually oftentimes watch the interaction and we see exactly how it's playing out. So that's been a huge benefit. So if a client, for instance, says that someone was excessive force, I can watch the body cam and see, how everything went down and how the encounter went. And that might just keep everybody a little bit more honest, having a body cam.
And Corporal Flynn, I would like your opinion about the body cam situation. I personally know that Gwinnett County is kind of new to the body cam. Explain to the audience a little bit about the new Gwinnett County policy.
Sure, absolutely. Gwinnett County went to the body cams about 3 years ago. When we went to this policy, we understand that the whole point of this is transparency, not only from the police side, but people want to be able to go back and see exactly what happened as it happened. So when we created this policy, we made it mandatory for our officers to turn the cameras on anytime they had an interaction with the general public. This has created a big load of data for us to have to go back and keep, which was honestly the biggest hurdle that we had to overcome with the Gwinnett County Police Department, because we do have almost 800 police officers. You're talking about 800 officers with multiple interactions with different people every single day and keeping all that data. But we felt as though it was something extremely important, not only to help the general public, but also to help the police officers so that we can get the word out there. If there is some type of allegation of misconduct, we can put the facts out there almost immediately in a lot of these cases. And it's worked to our benefit, and in some cases, possibly to our detriment, but we prefer to be honest and we prefer to be transparent, and the body cams is just another avenue that's allowed us to be that.
And Corporal Flynn, how do you feel, or how do you believe that police in diverse communities is, especially has it changed due to the recent social unrest that we're dealing with right now?
Well, I think 2020 has just been a crazy year all the way around, especially for the police, right? And I think that this year has gone back to, we have to remind the general public of two things. Number one, the police are here to serve. And throughout everything that's happened this year, that's kind of gotten lost on a lot of people, that number one, the police are here to serve the community. We're here to help. And a vast majority of police officers only want to be here to serve. And it's taken some reminding the general public of that. And, sometimes that can be very difficult when bad things have happened here in 2020. But we're really trying to put the word out there that this is what our goal is. We want to serve you, the public. And then the second thing that's really been big for us is making sure that people have a voice. People want to be able to question the police department, and that's totally well and good. And we want to give them an opportunity and avenue to do so. Just like Ms. Levy has the ability to go and file an open records request against a police officer, we wanted to let the general public know that they have the same rights to do that. If they feel as though that they've been mistreated by a police officer, we want to make sure that they have the voice to go in and tell someone about that. And so we find that when we police in diverse communities, we've got to really hit the ground running and remind people, number one, that we're here to serve, and number two, that they have a voice in how the police are going to interact with their community and what to expect from the police.
And do you find, Corporal Flynn, that different diverse communities have different expectations of law enforcement?
Absolutely. Gwinnett County, for anybody that doesn't know, is a very diverse community as well. We have almost 1 million residents here that have come from multiple different countries all over the world. And one thing that we've learned is that all those different cultures have different expectations of the police, mainly based on their experiences and where they've come from all around this world. And so that can be a very big challenge for the police to go out into each of these communities. And once again, it comes down to those two very simple things of making them understand that we're here to serve them and giving them a voice. And so we find that although they maybe have different expectations or maybe have come from different areas around the world where they've had different experiences with the police, at least here they can always have those two things.
And you had mentioned transparency earlier. How has the need for transparency changed over the years?
I mean, that's a huge one with not only the world, but police in general, right? I come from a criminal investigations background. I worked robbery and homicide for years. And when I first became an investigator, the most common thing you would hear from the police a lot of times is, well, this is an active investigation. We will tell you when we feel we should tell you. And in a lot of cases, they probably could have shared the information faster. And in this 2020 world that we're living in, where people have an expectation to receive the news much faster, to receive information much faster, you see police departments all across the country becoming far more transparent with the public, which is great. Oftentimes when you have an officer-involved shooting now, you routinely see that body cam video quickly being released by that department, which 10, 15, 20 years ago, you may not have seen that quick response. And I think police departments are coming to the forefront now and realizing, hey, the number one way to build trust is to just do it with transparency. And at least here in Gwinnett County, that is our number one thing, and that's my job as far as the public information officer, is to build a relationship with the media, but also build a relationship with the general public and provide information out to the public when it's necessary.
And Mr. Brooks, if I may, in the regards with talking about transparency, how have you seen the shift of transparency through the criminal justice system over the years?
Corporal Flynn was absolutely spot on when the common retort was it's an active investigation. There are certain ethics rules that prohibit prosecutors from speaking publicly about cases. But to the extent that we can shed light on cases, then we do, to the extent that we can. But it's limited based on the Georgia Rules of Professional Conduct. But I will offer this: in the age of digital media and social media, it's not hard to shed light on certain incidents that are in the public eye. You take any type of case that may have sparked protests, then a prosecutor in that instance, it's hard to be silent because there's data, there's evidence that's out there that the prosecutor in a limited capacity may be able to speak to.
And we've talked about transparency with law enforcement and the need for body cam, how that has shifted, obviously to be transparent, but also to kind of, in some instances, to be able to show misconduct on law enforcement part. So Mr. Brooks, I would like to ask you about prosecutorial misconduct from the actual prosecutors. Is there something along the same notion? Because I think when you talk to the general public and when you hear about news clips and whatnot, what they generally talk about when misconduct in the criminal justice system, it's law enforcement related. So I want to talk about prosecutorial misconduct. And if you can enlighten us a little bit about that.
So prosecutors are governed by the Georgia rules, the rules of professional evidence, wherever you are, rules of professional conduct, wherever you are in the state, in your particular state. But in Georgia specifically, and I'll speak to Georgia because that's what I'm most familiar with, the rules, there are a special set of rules that govern prosecutors aside from the general bar rules. And what I've recently learned is that prosecutors in the state of Georgia is the only state that the ultimate penalty for misconduct is not disbarment. But I will say there's an active effort among the prosecution community to move for a rules change to actually make the ultimate penalty for misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, disbarment. And the rationale for that is because, like the general lawyer community, we police ourselves. And that's kind of a lot of professional industries. Ourselves. I will also add that within the prosecution community, there is a great amount of restraint that's required because the state wields a great deal of power. And so in the conversations that I've had with colleagues is that with authority comes restraint. And so I will say it's been my experience in talking to colleagues and in working in prosecution that prosecutors are some of the most stand-up people that I've ever met. Now, that's not to say that misconduct does not happen. but it does happen. And when it happens, we police ourselves and ensure that the appropriate penalty is executed.
And Ms. Levy, if you don't mind, I would like your opinion about prosecutorial misconduct from the defense attorney standpoint. Is this something that you have come across? And if you have, how have you dealt with it?
I've been practicing, I think, for almost 28 years. And as far as I know of, I've only come into contact with it twice. I mean, I may be naive, but I feel like my experiences have been, and again, I work in mostly major cities, I work in Atlanta, Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett. So I was lied to directly by a prosecutor. I handled it by calling him out on it and resolving the issue in a way that was favorable to my client. And I never forgot it. I always had to remember that. And then another situation where I thought I was told an untruth. I apparently misunderstood. So made sure there was clarity in the future. But for the most part, I feel like my dealings, and again, maybe this is me being naive, I've never felt lied to. I've never felt like anybody was hiding anything. I mean, back in the day in DeKalb, when I started as a public defender in 1993, we would literally walk into the DA's office, grab the files that were ours, take them back to our office, copy them, and return them. And the red file, oh my God, I'm so sorry. The red file was their work product, and we would leave it there, take everything else, and bring it back ourselves. I mean, we literally would walk in their offices and grab it. So I just always sort of had that kind of experience. I've been very lucky.
And I'll tell the audience as well as the other panelists, I know Ms. Levy, I consider her to be a dear friend. And Ms. Levy is one of the few defense attorneys that can walk up to me and be like, hey, can I ask you about this case? And I will literally hand her my entire file. Work product is in there because I trust the fact that Ms. Levy is not going to do anything unethical, that she's not going to cross any lines, because that's a relationship that the two of us built together. And that's refreshing because, very frankly, I don't have that kind of relationship with everyone. I mean, not even just other defense attorneys. There are probably some prosecutors I wouldn't want them rooting around in my file.
Well, and the reality is, Ms. Ruth or Sam, for us to have that relationship, in the end, it helps my clients. For me to be above board and for me to be somebody that you trust. Because when I come to you and say, hey, maybe you're having a problem with this witness, here are my thoughts, you're going to believe what I tell you because I've never given you a reason not to. As one of your dear colleagues who passed away, Mr. McDaniel, after we tried a case, he said, I will never disbelieve you about a witness again when I got a not guilty on a ag assault. He was like, I will never not trust what you tell me about my victim again. So, and you build that rapport. And I think it's not only important to me personally to be above board, it only can help my clients. And that's really, at the end of the day, what we're looking for.
And Mr. Brooks, do you find that it's important as a prosecutor and for the prosecutors in your office to foster that kind of professional, ethical, moral relationship with the defense attorneys for the betterment of not only your victims, but as well as the defendants that are coming through your court system?
Absolutely. Absolutely. At the end of the day, both defense and prosecution want justice. Our interpretation of justice might be different, but we both want some sense of justice. And usually that's somewhere right down the middle. A lot of prosecution offices employ a open file policy because the reality is there's nothing to hide. If my case is strong, it's strong. If it's weak, it's weak. And at the end of the day, it's not a loss or a win, because in prosecution offices, they should never be driven by losses or wins. They should be driven about what's the truth and what's justice, what's the right thing to do. And so fostering a good relationship with the defense bar is something that is suggested and admired in my office. In fact, it's funny, we just had a coffee conversation with the defense bar to get feedback on how the interactions have been with the office.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And Mr. Yee, I would ask you, in your office, do you guys have, as Mr. Brooks has just referred to, as an open file policy?
Well, where do I even start with this one? Let's just say in January 1st of 2020, we had a major overhaul of our discovery and bail laws. Bail and discovery reform is what they call it. And it changed twice in 1 year. So long story short, within 15 days of arraignment, as of January 1st, we had to have our discovery provided to the defense unless it was a voluminous long-term case. Then they felt, I guess, certain changes had to be made in the middle of the year. They changed that to 30 days. So let's just say the open file concept is now very radically different. So I don't think discovery or hiding discovery is going to be so much of an issue in New York.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the topic that you guys were discussing before, and this is for all the defense attorneys as well, if we have a trust that, for example, something like you and Ms. Levy have, and I have with a couple of other defense attorneys, and I always tell my colleagues too, and especially the rookie ADAs, those are the two defense attorneys in the entire court system that if they told me, Matt, this guy's innocent, I think this guy's innocent. And amongst my busy and long caseload, that will make me go back and look at it that much more. And that's real, like Mr. Brooks was saying, that's where justice could be met halfway. So sometimes I'm not understanding where defense attorneys are taught or actually believe in just make the prosecutor's life as miserable as possible, file every single motion you could possibly do. And then at the end, so I'm not sure where that goes. But yes, I totally nod and agree with what you guys were talking about there. And as far as discovery, yes, we're in a different world right now.
And Ms. Levy was vigorously shaking her head. No, don't do it. Don't make their lives any more difficult. It doesn't end well.
And bring snacks to court. That's what I always do.
Absolutely. Now, that was a fantastic discussion about that. And I'm glad we segued into that. What I do want to briefly talk about and talk with is Lieutenant Reddick. We had mentioned earlier during the introductions, he's the lieutenant of the newly formed Community Affairs Unit out of Gwinnett County PD. Lieutenant Reddick, what spurred the formation of this particular unit?
Recent events around the country, 2020, like Corporal Flynn said, has been a doozy pretty much. So bringing, with all the different issues with police shootings and civil unrest, we thought it was best to be proactive and to form the Community Affairs section.
And I'm kind of reading between the lines here. I believe that the purpose is to go ahead and build this relationship with the community, so that way, if unfortunately something bad happens, you're not trying to come in and build a relationship in the middle of a bad situation, but you already have it beforehand. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. Credibility, equity is big. Once we have the community engaged with the police department in a positive manner, sharing with them how we do things and why we do things, as well as them interacting with us, that can only be a positive thing. Additionally, as it was said earlier, in the event that a crime occurs in a community, having built that relationship will assist the police in solving such crimes.
And what kind of programs does the Gwinnett County Community Affairs Unit plan to build and to foster a good relationship with the community?
Well, in addition to our neighborhood watch and our multi-housing watch, we also have the Explorers and the Citizens Police Academy. But in addition to that, we're looking into instituting the Police Athletic League, which is called PAL, which would employ volunteers of police officers coaching youth in various sports. The first one that we're looking into instituting is track and field. Also, we were looking into some type of program to help include immigrants and new immigrants in our community. And what Mr. Yee was talking about earlier with the advisory councils sounds very attractive. So I may be having to have a conversation with Mr. Yee later. But yeah, we're in the process of researching that and trying to get something like that started here in Gwinnett County.
And Is this a unit that you see the county and the police department investing a lot of resources in over the next several months and into years?
Yes, I do know that we are slated to have some more supervisors come over and maybe even some more officers. With what the chief has put on our plate that we're going to be handling, we're going to need more resources and more staff.
And Mr. Brooks has been shaking his head very happily about hearing about this. And is there something similar to this type of a unit in Clayton County?
There is. We have a community affairs unit and as well as the implementation of a PAL, a police athletic league. With COVID, it was actually starting the beginning of 2020, but March, the world kind of changed. And so I suspect as we move into 2021, probably mid-year 2021 or late 2021, it'll actually jump off.
Okay. And
Can I
sitting
ask Officer
quietly-
Reddick a question?
Oh, sure.
Is there outreach in the schools as well?
There isn't any outreach in the schools per se without a teacher requesting us to come in and speak to the students.
But you're available for it if you were
We are
requested.
available for it to maybe do some teen driving, drug awareness type classes and just have a conversation if that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
And this
okay, I
kind of
think
goes
that's
in,
great.
and this kind of goes in line with what Mr. Brooks was talking about earlier about getting ahead with and involved in youth affairs. And I believe that's what the PD is trying to also help with. Is that correct, Lieutenant Reddick?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay. And I can tell from the Gwinnett County District Attorney's Office, we were also at some point, ADAs were going into schools and speaking with students about different types of crimes that were specifically tailored to situations that children or youth might find themselves in as a way to try to prevent them from going down that particular road. I do want to say, very patiently sitting here, nodding his head in agreement and in excitement, is Professor Byrd. And Professor, you have been listening, which I really appreciate. And per your biography, we told the audience about how you are presenting and teaching and educating on implicit bias. And so tell the audience a little bit about what that is and why you felt like it was necessary to have that type of training available to the public.
Absolutely. And just for, conversation's sake, so that it's clear, this beautiful nation we live in, the United States of America, has its Constitution. And if you look at the implicit bias topic, the conversation, alongside the Constitution, it starts to make sense. And here's what I mean. When the country was founded, the definition of justice, the definition of fair was one way. But as we changed and progressed and, along with the Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th amendments, now the definition of a person has now been broadened. Equal treatment has now changed, and that's been broadened. Voting rights has changed. And so now when we talk about what's fair and what's just, the definition that was in place at the founding of the country has changed. But guess what? By this time, we still don't have this idea of fairness and justice for women with respect to the vote. That didn't come into the 1900s, right? 1918, I believe. And so what I'm saying is that this idea of implicit bias, this unconscious bias, is about things that you may not be aware of. And in fact, you aren't necessarily aware of when it comes to your treatment and your actions towards other individuals. And so in America, a country that was primarily, if you will, European with respect to those who were in the majority, who had power at one time, what was just and what was fair, it was very clear. And as Corporal Flynn mentioned, law enforcement has always been there to serve, but who are you serving? And so as populations changed, as Mr. Yee said, up in New York with so much diversity, who you serve has fundamentally changed. But what has not always happened is those individuals who are responsible in the courts, corrections, law enforcement, their policies and procedures have not always caught up with this change changing demographics. And so that when individuals go into the community, law enforcement, they may not have that historical understanding of these new emerging populations. And so as it is in a restaurant, if you don't speak to me and ask me what I want, you can't properly serve me. And so you have to talk to folks, you have to understand them. And as Mr. Brooks said, now with this move towards restorative justice, making individuals, making communities whole, as Ms. Levy talked about these accountability courts, we're learning that it's not just about, justice as it's traditionally been, but it's about justice for each diverse community. And we found in the criminal justice system with these accountability courts, with this restorative justice movement, if you will, across the country, that we have a lot of gains with respect to gaining trust. And in these, if you will, sanctuary cities where individuals can trust law enforcement and know that immigration is not going to be an issue. But implicit bias is pretty much all of that. But the idea is that you come to the table with these preconceptions, and a lot of times you aren't aware, and it comes across in your treatment. And oftentimes it's unfair.
And how do you help people identify implicit biases that they may have, that they don't realize that they have?
Okay, excellent. And again, it's because it's unconscious. And one of the things that I've been able to do is provide some training on this. And if you think of it in this way, when you come to a new country, the laws are different, the people are different. You don't necessarily understand everyone. But if you've never traveled outside of the country, you see the world in a certain way. But what happens is, in law enforcement, in the courts, and the corrections, for a long time, we've done things in a certain way. And we've not necessarily had to consider different viewpoints and opinions because we have been doing what we understood to be just and fair according to current policies and procedures. But as we broaden these definitions of that include diversity, women, different nationalities, we don't necessarily speak these languages. We don't necessarily know these cultures. And so we may act in a traditional sense, but at the same time, step on the toes and disrespect others just by not having a cultural understanding, just by not having an understanding of different groups and their ethics. And that's why, that's kind of what we teach to, that you don't know everyone. And sometimes what is normal and what is fair and what's just to you and what's respectful to you could be disrespectful to others. And so that's kind of how we treat it. Everyone comes to the table, if you will, based on how you grow up, your religion, your household. We all come to the table or come into our professions with understandings and viewpoints of the world. And they generally don't encompass 100% of all the perspectives of those who will be served. And so it's not a bad thing that we have these unconscious biases. It's just almost a blind spot that we have to know is there. And we're always evolving to make sure that we're bettering ourselves to better serve others.
And who have you actually performed this implicit bias training to? Like what kind of agencies, schools, who has taken advantage of this type of training?
Most recently, the Clayton County Solicitor General's office, we did a number of different weeks worth of training where we talked about implicit bias, as well as, this idea of diversity and inclusion over a number of weeks. But it started when I worked with some law enforcement executives teaching an ethics course for the Moses Ector Law Enforcement Leadership Academy in Atlanta. And I've also done it with my initiative and company, Teach Us Justice, bringing along law enforcement, attorneys, students, other community stakeholders as we go to historic sites and landmarks throughout the Southeastern United States, looking at the evolution of law, policy, and social justice. And definitely unconscious bias, implicit bias is part of that, as well as this idea of diversity and inclusion.
And as we were talking about earlier, when we had the different panelists talking about different kind of programs that they were implementing, that have been implemented, that may have been rejuvenated recently, or a reinvestment into it, you were really excited about it. Your head was very much yes, smiling just like that. And this is the type of change that we want to see happening. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And I think I was nodding my head when Ms. Levy was talking about these different accountability courts, as well as Mr. Brooks, because that was my introduction to the criminal justice profession at Georgia State University. My very first internship was the Fulton County Drug Court. And I saw how wonderful those types of programs could be. And it really encouraged me to go ahead on into my career in law enforcement.
And Mr. Brooks, Professor Byrd has mentioned that you actually took advantage of this particular training. I want to know why you felt like it was important to have this particular training for your office.
It's important that leaders in the criminal justice system are responsive to the calls of their community. And so the cries of the community demand social justice. And so if you're heeding the calls of social justice, you need to understand that language, and you need to train all folks who interact with a case what that means. You know, I like to say in my office, you know, every one of these cases aren't a case, they're a person. And not only is a person, it's a family. And not only is a family, it's a community. And not only is a community, it's the county. And so if you keep that at the center of how you move in the criminal justice system, and always be people-centered, justice will definitely follow.
And I feel like Corporal Flynn, this kind of almost resonates with some of the stuff that you were talking about earlier, the need for transparency, the police, people need to be reminded that police are here to serve, as well as that people need a voice. They need to be able to express themselves if something good happened, if something bad happens. Do you think that implicit bias training, excuse me, is something that the law enforcement agency would benefit from as well?
You know, it's interesting. Prior to being in my current position, I was a full-time academy instructor. And in 2018, we actually gave a full hour of instruction on implicit bias and helping officers to understand, because this is a really hot button topic right now, as far as we're finally starting to realize that the experiences that we have in life fill in the blocks, if you will, for the things that we don't know. And I always tell people, one of the worst things you can do in detective work is to have a set of facts in front of you that maybe is not a complete story. And you might not even realize it, but that piece of the story gets filled in, and you fill in those areas that you don't know with your experiences and what you believe happened based on the experiences that you've had in life. And sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. So it's good to be aware of these implicit biases. It's good because at the end of the day, not only does it make you a better person, it makes you a really good, better cop as well. And so it's fantastic training. I thought it was great training. And it's something that we're definitely going to continue to take advantage of at the police academy here in Gwinnett County as well. And
that's fantastic, because my experiences as an Asian American woman is very different from your experiences as a white male, which is very different from Professor Byrd's experiences as a Black male in America. And it's really refreshing to see this movement across all the different avenues of the criminal justice system. Not only law enforcement, as well as prosecutors and defense attorneys kind of working towards trying to be the best that they can be so that society benefits from this system. And Professor Byrd is just super happy right now. I can just tell he is just beaming on this. And let me see, and Professor Byrd, you and I had an opportunity to speak on the phone earlier, and you said something that I felt was very, it resonated with me. And then later on, I had the opportunity to speak with Lieutenant Reddick. And kind of thinking back once again, when I was reading Lieutenant Reddick's biography, I had mentioned that part of the reason that he became a law enforcement officer was because he wanted to bridge the gap between law enforcement, the idea of what law enforcement does. He wanted to bridge that gap between that and the community at large. And you really started shaking your head, yes. And that's because you and I spoke about that earlier, that even law enforcement officers' experiences shift them potentially into their desire, into wanting to be law enforcement officers. Is that fair?
Indeed. We had a discussion And I think it started out along the lines of, why do individuals go into law enforcement, and could they go into law enforcement for different reasons? And we kind of, pair that against, the community's respect, trust, and sometimes distrust of law enforcement. And it's interesting because, in some instances, folks go into law enforcement and again, it goes to
I think we may have a little bit of a technical issue. Here he comes.
okay, I was breaking up.
Yeah, no, there you are. Please continue.
Folks go into law enforcement to ensure that justice is served. There are individuals from different pockets or different communities who go into law enforcement because the definition of justice seems unjust to them, and they want law enforcement so that justice is served for their respective community as other communities. And what I mean by that is, 1906, they were into Georgia, and there was a book called Darktown that was written, and you learn one of the individuals chose to go into law enforcement, despite this idea of Jim Crow and law enforcement not necessarily the time or the community, not to go into law enforcement to maintain a particular system. His mom, his dad, his sisters, his brothers, his children would be respected as they walk down the street. And so again, folks go into law enforcement for different reasons, and that we really with that definition of justice, as Mr. Brooks has said, a lot of times it's what lies in the middle. But that particular conversation.
Okay. And Mr. Yee, it's a little bit of an impromptu question that I'm about to pose to you, but why did you decide to become a prosecutor?
As opposed to a lawyer, what people like me is supposed to go into, right?
Right. Or a doctor.
Medicine, engineering, law is still considered one of the professions that we can get away with without being the black sheep of the family. I chose it quite simply because when I, thought about what major I was going to do in college, I did go the pre-med route because of societal pressures, and I hated every moment of it. And then I switched to law because I liked the aspects of it, and I interned here and there. And when I came to law school, and interned at the DA's office where I am now, I absolutely loved it and just felt like this was it. And before that, of course, I had issues of what crime was like. Or we victims as Asian Americans were quite powerless. I come from an immigrant background. I came when I was 6, and my parents were powerless to do much about anything. So that being said, I felt like I can make a contribution, and thankfully, it fits my personality and my drive. And whenever by the way, I'm 40 years old now, and I feel like I've been in this profession for quite a while, and this is all I've known after law school. And now that I'm at a point in my career where I'm meeting folks like you guys, performing lectures and doing seminars, I always open or close with a quote from Gandhi that says, look, the true measure of a society you could find by seeing how they treat the most vulnerable. And that's something that I keep in mind when I'm taking on a case where I have to review thousands of pages for a case that may not even get much attention or may not even lead to an arrest, and just causes so much effort and time and resources, but that's somebody's life savings that was just defrauded, right? As opposed to if I'm now looking for, the stat or the notoriety, that's the case that I kind of shoo away, right? And that's something that I want to instill in others. So why did I pick law enforcement and being this office? I feel like this is where I can best serve my community. And thankfully, I like it.
And I want to now shift to what I've referred to as the forgotten side of bias and prejudice in the criminal justice system. I think that generally, at least my perspective, is that when people talk about bias and prejudice in the criminal justice system, it's initially at the beginning. It's the investigation, it's the arrest, it's the prosecution. But there is a side that prosecutors are very well aware of, and that defense attorneys have experienced as well. It's this when you may have a case where race becomes an issue, where you may have a victim of a certain racial group, and the jury has decided that, for a lack of a better term, it's a throwaway. They don't care as much because the victim is X. Or you have a particular situation where you have a juror who gets in there into the jury room, hears the case, and then tells the other jurors, I'm not going to convict the defendant because he's X, because they're trying to right a social wrong, if you will. Beginning with Mr. Brooks, I would like to hear your take on, have you encountered this particular forgotten side, and how did you deal with it, and how have you dealt with it after it came, after the resolution has happened?
I think every criminal law attorney has experienced it as a trial attorney, either defense or prosecution. The runaway jury, or as you put it, the one that's trying to right a social wrong. And I'll give you a perfect story. In several years ago, I was called to sit for jury duty. Okay, I didn't identify myself as a prosecutor, as I was standing online with the rest of the jury pool. As I was standing online, I was just listening to some of the commentary from some of my fellow jurors, and one guy, he was rather loud in the line. He would say, you know, unless they kill somebody, I don't care what it is, they're gonna be not guilty. Okay. Now, I was, at that time, I think I was chief assistant solicitor. Okay. And in the solicitor's office in Georgia, we deal primarily with misdemeanor cases. And for those that don't know what misdemeanors are, we're talking about petty crimes, crimes that people really don't care about, or crimes that people can easily or readily identify with. It's easy to identify with a person that had a DUI. Because it crosses all social, economic classes. And so, how did I respond to that? I didn't internalize it, because I had to recognize that whatever his experience was may have been a sour experience with the criminal justice system. But I took away from that, I have to make these cases matter and make it relevant. One of my favorite cases that I remember prosecuting wasn't a murder case. It wasn't a aggravated assault. It was a disorderly house case. And why do I reference that case? There was a group of neighbors in a cul-de-sac, and this one house in the cul-de-sac always had kids over. Now, the guy who owned the house, he never supervised these kids. He put up a basketball goal to attract the children. There was suspicion behind that, but without going into detail behind what the suspicion was, he always had these kids of every age, from 7 through early 20s. And these kids, they would go through people's yards, get into the basketball goal. They would sometimes be out there cussing, sometimes they'd be fussing and fighting, and he would never supervise them. So these neighbors, they came together. They called the local law enforcement. Law enforcement staked out the cul-de-sac, and ultimately issued them citations for a disorderly house. Like, he took the case to arraignment. He said he was not guilty. You know, he didn't do anything wrong. He was just giving these kids a safe space where they could play basketball. Okay, and where they could be in a place without having to be bothered by anybody. I took the case. I had these cooperating neighbors, and ultimately he was found guilty for a disorderly house. The neighbors ultimately thanked me. The guy ultimately ended up moving. And to this day, I still keep in touch with community of neighbors. And the reason that matters is because that was an impact on their quality of life. And so when you're talking about the runaway jury, you're talking about a jury that doesn't understand the impact of that offense on them. And so when you have in these cases that might not be the most sexy of cases, and I think Attorney Yee mentioned that, you know, the case where that was this person's life savings, he made it matter to the jury because it was this person's life savings. And though you can't say, you know, it could have happened to you, you have to express that in a way that is legally permissible, that this same experience can impact your quality of life, and it does impact your quality of life.
And Ms. Levy, you were shaking your head when Mr. Brooks was talking about the jury needs to kind of care. And is that, although from a defense standpoint, you still want them to care about your client's position. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. You know, again, you just never know unless someone tells you how they're feeling. But I have definitely had jurors express in voir dire how they could not be fair because the police are, you know, always lie or what have you. And to me, I think that's a shame because you could actually affect a change by keeping an open mind and listening to the evidence and making a decision and maybe changing someone in the jury's mind. You know, if you make it onto a panel, you could actually go back there and explain some things and maybe open some other minds instead of kind of coming out there in the beginning and saying you can't be fair. Because really we want fair jurors. I mean, that's at the end of the day, I want people to kind of keep an open mind because, you know, it's a finite time that we get to spend with them. And so if they could keep an open mind, then they really could affect change, as opposed to saying, I'm never going to convict somebody like Mr. Brooks had mentioned. And some people just come right out and say that. Well, then you can't be on a juror because you have to talk with your jurors and you have to deliberate with them. And if you don't, then you can't be part of that. And I think it's a shame that some people don't allow themselves to be part of it because I think that's where real change could come in.
And Professor Byrd, I want to ask you, kind of piggybacking off of what Ms. Levy has just said, that it's a shame that some people are unwilling to have that conversation, to open up their minds to a different perspective. How, in your implicit bias training, how easy has it been for people to accept the fact that they may have implicit bias and that to address it and then to make that change?
And to answer your question in a very short way, it's difficult. For example, I took the implicit bias or the implicit association test and found that I have unconscious bias to the extent that I am less trustful of African Americans. And I'm someone who goes out every day trying to serve the African American community, right? And so the idea is that I have biases, unconscious bias against African Americans. And I'm like, there's no way that, you know, that's what I would think from an objective mind, if you will. No, there's no way I have any bias. I'm Black. How can I be distrustful of Black people and have these aversions towards Black people, if you will? But the same thing goes. That's one of the things we really have to harp on. There's nothing wrong with having these biases, but a lot of times folks don't want to admit, sometimes out of shame, sometimes, hey, see, I told you so. That's why we have all these problems, because people like you have these biases and you're treating people unfairly. See, I told you so. I think it's the fear of being kind of called out, but it's creating that safe space so that across the board, regardless of the profession, it shouldn't be a type of training to beat up on others, but to educate, because again, we all have them, but it's very difficult for some to admit that, you know, some of these things may be true and they should consider opening, if you will, their minds.
Now, at this point, I would like to shift a little bit over to some of the Q&As. We do have two currently in the Q&A section. Beginning with Ms. Britton, she has written this: many jurisdictions don't have an open file system and fight that move. Discovery is formal and lots of abuses occur by prosecutors. How do you recommend that states or counties remedy that? I've worked in an office with an open file system and it worked very well, but I've also worked in an office that I described above. I would like, if you don't mind, Mr. Brooks's opinion about this. As a Solicitor General and someone who's worked felony and misdemeanor cases, if you don't mind.
The culture starts from the top, and so if it's a practice that's endorsed by whoever the elected or appointed lead chief prosecutor is, then it's something that'll flow down to a trial line. But ultimately, if it's not endorsed or supported, then perhaps a conversation with the elected about the pros and the cons. And from that conversation, I would extend it to even a conversation with the defense bar about the necessity or how it could work. I think at the core of it, it really boils down to trust. And so if there's a relationship of trust between the prosecution community and the defense bar, then it can work.
In my jurisdiction, and I'll say on my part, we do formal discovery. So we give you all the packets, the digital discovery, but we also have an open file system where at any point, anybody, defense attorney wise, can contact us and say, hey, no offense, but I'd like to look through your file just to make sure I'm not missing anything. And obviously any work product that I find or that I've done, I may remove. But that is something that we've got. So we have kind of a dual system where at any point you can ask for it. Also, I've dealt with a situation where I've turned my file over to the judge. It may be something that if the defense attorney feels that there are grounds that the prosecutor is withholding information, he can file a motion, address it with the court, and the court can actually do an in-camera of my file as well to make sure that I'm not withholding something that is exculpatory. And then the second question for the panel, and what we're going to do is I will then ask for each of you to respond to this. What changes would each of you like to see in your role in the criminal justice system? And I'm going to begin with Mr. Yee.
You just get me over. That caught me off guard there.
Making sure you're paying attention.
Minutes ago. So you're not going to get to skip over me?
No.
What changes? Listen, I've been through so much change in the past 12 months in my prosecutorial career that I feel like I am working in a new office under a different administration, under completely different discovery and bail laws, that I am seeing change firsthand, as opposed to when I first started here, where, for example, marijuana arrests were plentiful, and it was still a crime, and now we barely even have those arrests anymore. We've come across a long way as far as police and prosecutorial accountability. So I am seeing a lot of changes, and reform was overdue in a lot of respects. What I like to ask is that for both sides, both the defense bar and the general public as well, is that if it goes too extreme, one way or the other, it's just going to cause the pendulum to swing the other way. I'm not sure if you catch what I mean, but, reform, sure, but, to a point where, for example, New York, whether you feel like the discovery reforms were proper or not, practically speaking, an office like us or Manhattan or Brooklyn or Bronx, where we are properly, I guess, funded and staffed, and we could actually just barely, even though it's painful, able to get the scanning system, get the support staff available to turn in. We got, for example, 50,000 arrests a year in our county. Discovery being turned over in all those cases is a monster. But for example, in upstate county where there's maybe 10 prosecutors and their funding is very limited, how in the world are they going to do that for every single case they come across?
Especially within such a short time period.
Correct, with the strict time period. So while I cannot stand certain policies as a prosecutor, for example, I've seen some offices say, take this offer now without turning over any kind of discovery, right? Otherwise our offer is going to go up. I get that. That's not cool. That's not good. But my practice is I'll be transparent. Here's the bare minimum discovery. Here's my plea offer. Please consider it. And then we'll talk. So yes, there have been a lot of changes that I would like to see that's actually been implemented already. But I'm just like to just add that, there should be moderation and like a good compromise that should be reached instead of having it too extreme one way or the other.
And absolutely, I think that it's fair to say that obviously justice is not just for one side or the other. You want justice for the people who are facing these charges and fair treatment and equality, but you also want it for your victims as well, because they're unfortunately in a situation that they didn't necessarily ask to be in. So I appreciate the idea that let's not forget all the parties involved in this, and everyone involved deserves fairness and equality and fair treatment. Professor Byrd, I'd like to hear your response to this particular question. What changes would you like to see in your role in the criminal justice system?
Absolutely, and thank you. I would like to see law enforcement officers receive a greater level of respect, number one. But with that, I think that there should be a significant amount of resources allocated their way so that, to Corporal Flynn's point, that they get a lot more training. I think that, with the power to take the life of another individual, just as a doctor operating on someone may ultimately, find themselves in that situation. If you have that type of power, you should be highly trained. And I don't think that there should be a lack of any resources whatsoever for law enforcement officers, which means that I think that the professionalization of law enforcement should continue to evolve. There was a day when all you had to do was raise your hand and you'd be deputized. We went through this professional era. I think that, six-figure salaries across the nation should be the low bar for law enforcement. But again, I think some of those educational requirements and training requirements would have to come along. I think with ultimately fewer officers on the street with all this technology, but I think that they should be paid, twice, maybe even three times as much. But I think, again, a lot more money allocated to the professionalization, if you will, that continued professionalization of law enforcement, so that we do have exactly what we want as far as those police in our communities.
Fantastic. And Ms. Levy, if you'll please answer that question, what changes would you like to see in your role in the criminal justice system?
I like my role in the criminal justice system because it's ever changing. Now I have an opportunity to help people get into accountability courts, and I love that part of it. I am on the appointed list in Gwinnett County. I'm a private attorney, but I also take appointed cases. And I find a lot of judges appoint me to the mental health clients that have a mental health issue. And I have to say, I thoroughly enjoy working with them, working with their families and helping them get into the right space. That's something that brings me joy to be able to help them in that way. So with the new accountability courts, it does help me sort of get that personal touch out there. And I like that. And I like being able to help people in that way. So I think as a defense attorney, we're kind of ever evolving. And this, with the new accountability courts, that's just a new way to help people. And again, at the end of the day, I truly do believe in justice. And I do always understand that there are victims. Not all my clients deserve to go home. It's just the reality of, it's the nature of what I do. But I'm just trying to look for something that's fair for everybody, that's going to leave a victim and a defendant knowing that people cared, and that the resolution is hopefully just and fair.
And Lieutenant Reddick, if you don't mind, please answer the question. What changes would you like to see in your role in the criminal justice system?
I see my role changing, or would like to see it change, as more of an educator, educator towards the public and police officers alike. With the public, that let them know that cops are people too. They're just, their neighbors, their family members, their church members. And let them know that the law, enforcing the law, is for the betterment of the community as a whole. And the next step would be is to educate police officers to not just police in a linear manner, meaning just not say you see a law broken and you treat every person the same. Every situation is different. Every individual is different. And also to have police officers teach them to treat each person with respect, regardless of the crime that they're accused of, or even about to be prosecuted for and jailed. But that respect, which is very inexpensive, goes quite a long way.
That's fantastic. And Mr. Brooks, if you don't mind, what changes would you like to see in your role in the criminal justice system?
I will echo what everyone has said, and only offer that I think there needs to be an infusion of resources, a huge infusion of resources in the criminal justice system. Just now, and because of a worldwide pandemic, the criminal justice system and courts have caught up with 21st century technology. There is now more than ever, I would say that a lot of government offices have incorporated technology into how they prosecute cases, how they review evidence. I think because of the pandemic, there's been a infusion of CARES money that allowed for some upgrades. But even on echoing what Professor Bird said, even on the compensation side, as relates to, at least on the government side, government or public sector compensation is anemic in comparison to private sector. But you want the best of the best, and we're dealing in criminal law on the government side. You're dealing with lives, versus on the private side, you're dealing with money. And if you're talking about what's more valued and what's compensated is when you're dealing with money, as opposed to when you're dealing with lives. And that seems upside down to me. And so I would encourage an infusion of resources into the criminal justice system. I think law enforcement needs more funding to incorporate some social service aspects. I think a lot of times the law enforcement community is overused as it relates to mental health cases, and not properly trained to handle, say, certain crisis incidents with mental health. So perhaps a social service person can be employed in the law enforcement community to assist in those types of cases. But overall, it's just a infusion of resources is what I would like to see.
And finally, Corporal Flynn, if you don't mind, please tell us what changes you would like to see in your role in the criminal justice system.
Sure. As everything that's happened this year has gone on, and I still speak with a lot of the recruits at the police academy, one of the trends I'm starting to see is a lot of these young police officers are coming in and they're catching flack from their families and their friends and their social circles about becoming a police officer. And I think that that's one of the most pervasive things that is going through our society right now, is that being a police officer isn't a good job. And until we have that universal respect and appreciation for police, and that works on both ends, the police have to have respect for the community, but to make this criminal justice system work better, to make the police work better, it's never going to get better unless we make this job appealing to people. They can get this job and feel proud to be a police officer, that they can go to their friends, go to their families, go to their peers and say, hey, I'm a police officer. I'm here to make a difference. I'm here to serve. And one thing I've seen in the last couple of years, and especially this year, is a lot of that's missing from a lot of these young kids that are joining the police ranks. And I hope we can come and find some middle ground, and we can find some appreciation for these men and women that are putting their lives on the line.
I agree with that. People who put pride in their work generally do better work. And we would all like to see better work from everybody involved. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that's the last question that we had in the Q&A. I hope that you had found this session informative. I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today. You are all on the front lines of defending and representing the change that is being called for by society. Everyone has a different opinion on this topic and lie at a different point on the spectrum. But what I think we can all agree on is that we need to do better as people, as prosecutors, as defense attorneys, and as law enforcement officers. We are capable of doing and being better. And I hope tonight's webinar has given you some insight into the different areas of the criminal justice system and that it has encouraged you to be better yourselves. I want to thank Andrea Alaby for putting this webinar together and the ABA for hosting it. If there are any other topics or even a continuation of this particular topic you would like to see done in the future, I'm sure they would be more than happy to take those suggestions on. And with that, thank you and happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.